I think I'll leave it in this format so you can actually see where I'm going over here on the side, so you can start thinking ahead if you have questions and things. This is a lot shorter than I've done in the past. So, and I've done a few other talks on water and wetlands and watershed. So go ahead and stop and ask anything. I'm going to go through some of the basics and some of the key ideas, but go ahead and ask questions at any time. And at the end, we'll open it up for even more questions if you like. But this is going to get deep into the weeds now. Okay, so there's a picture. Let's see. Come on, let's show that one. Okay, so these are again, this is our watershed. It's in the gray area, and you can see our river, and everybody can see the pointer down here. And this is historic river. So we're going to do a comparison later on of showing you what this river looks like now compared to what it was. But this is what 100 years ago or 150 years before the Europeans showed up and managing the wetlands and the rivers and the water, what our watershed looked like. So this is history.
Can you just say what these other rivers are showing up above the Petaluma River?
Okay, so we have Petaluma River here that's coming up this line here. And then we have all these various creeks. It turns out this is San Antonio Creek, which is probably one of the larger ones with a little, there is a couple small reservoirs that the farmers have built all along this. And it's highly eroded in here. But this San Antonio Creek that's coming in on this side, that enters in, joins in right here on this angle right here, and then comes down in. You have the river that comes all the way up, and there's various things. You have, we have on this one right here, I think is the Adobe Creek that comes up this way. We have the Leechow Washington Creeks that come up all the way up this way. And then there's a few others. There's Corona Creek, Leechow, and Leechow is up here. And then there's a couple others that are up smaller, but at some point some of these creeks did not flow into the river. They flowed into basically meadows, and then they drained through the meadows and came on down. Notice that all this green area up here. This was actually a flat wetland. Our entire east side of Petaluma was a full marsh wetland area that flooded constantly when it rained, and it was a big flat area. That's why it looks flat up here, because this was flat. It's a delta area for all these creeks, and the creeks did not flow into the river. They flowed into the meadow areas. This whole section, the whole east side was like that before it flowed in. And then here's the old marsh, and this old marsh is 5,000 acres plus that used to be here, and we've lost a lot of it. This was all marshland all throughout here. And notice how wide the river was at the front end here. So,
John,
yes.
John, this is Jean. So how far back does the Petaluma River go? At what point does it stop being the Petaluma River?
Okay, so it goes on up here, and it kind of snakes up here a little bit. But the official sort of, we have a break in our river. If you ever walk down there and take the Lynch Creek Trail, and you walk over there, I think at one point you'll see a cement barrier. It goes by the outlet mall. So up through the outlet mall up here, we have the wetlands up here that are still open lands that were big battles coming between private land and public land. It's privately owned right now, a lot of it. The Corona Reach goes up here. And so at the end, right up here, is sort of where the official river, and it's not a river, it's a slough, not a river. But this water ends here. But these are all temporary creeks that come in. They are not year round, so that they're called creeks. But right in here, there's an influx. There's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 creeks that flow into this area here, which is why it floods so much, because you have 6 or 7 creeks that actually flow into the same area up here, which is in the hills just before you cross over the hill into going up north. So where I have some of the vineyards now all up here, and that all kind of flows in and follows the flooding. So that's where there's sort of it starts up here, but it kind of where it actually starts depending on what rainy season it is. Right in this section.
Thank you. So basically the Petaluma River is truly a slough that goes back to, and it's fed by some seasonal creeks.
Right, because it's not a complete river because it doesn't, there's inflows only during the rainy season. And
Understood. Thank you. Yeah.
there's only a little bit of flow in the summer times. And
Oh,
occasionally
yeah.
it stops flowing down.
John, is it called a creek in the upper parts?
Yeah, these are all,
Because it isn't a river anymore by then.
yeah, I'm not sure how they name it. They still call it the Petaluma River to
Mm.
keep it easy, but it turns, these upper areas turn more into a creek areas, and then these all have separate names, all these different ones up here. There's like 5 or 6 of them. They all have different names. And this whole area is floods area. This is where the farmland is, right up here. Okay, and then when Europeans came 150 years ago and started to farm, and they started doing things with the river, and we became very rich in the 1860s through the 1890s. In there for 10 years, we were the richest town in the United States because of the eggs and hay that we were sending down to San Francisco during the gold rush days. So the per capita wealth of the town was very, very high, and you still see it in our downtown history. But here's 3 sections. Here's river. Here's the early river on this side here. And you can see that it was much wider in the past. It had little areas on the side here that kind of stretched in, that stretched out. It banked kind of weird at angles here. And then it went weave. And there were, I think, up to 70 turns. So boats had to make 70 turns coming around all these different little angles, especially in the upper river, before it got up into the area where they actually could dock up here at where we now have the marina. The marina's over here, but the downtown area is right in here. And you see all these twists and turns, and some of the larger boats struggled. And in fact, there was one captain that was very proud that they could get their boat in at nighttime because they actually timed. They had speed that went at, and they had a watch. And even at nighttime, he actually was able to converse and not get stuck. But because everybody got stuck occasionally in all these turns, they said, okay, so we need to help out. So the first, so 2 groups of people have come in. We did have the federal Bureau of Reclamation and come in and did straighten things out. So you see what happened here. So a lot of this area, there was actually 4 or 5 sections that got straightened. There was actually 5 or 6 they were supposed to do. They only did about 4 or 5 of these sections that they straightened things out, and they put in this little, the McNair Peninsula is completely artificial. And that peninsula, and also our turning basin way up here, were dug out by the Chinese who came here after the railroads. A bunch of the railroads stopped building. A lot of Chinese came here, and we used them as labor to dredge and make the McNair Island and the turning basin. But the straightening was done by the Bureau, the Interior Department. Bureau of Reclamation came in and did the scooping out with more machinery, steam-based machinery, straighten all this out. So here's a comparison. Here's the 2 overlaid, the old versus the new. And you can see the dark blue is the old, the light blue is the new, what we currently have. And you see how things have been changed all along the line. See how things have been cut off and modified. So instead of a nice slow flow, fairly muddy, it's been straightened up and a lot more faster water movement happening. Here's a picture. But let's go down here. Originally, this is what it looked like before. This is a map from the 1800s showing someone went out there and actually drew what they could find, and it's called Dendritic Pattern. So there's dendrites, and there's mathematics to it that come along with all these dendrites. But you see how it changes the width of it, and entries on it were all changed. And now it looks pretty even and straight. So farmers came in and they diked the entire length on both sides of the river, all the way up. All this has been diked by the farmers, and to contain and control. So was farmland down on this side now. On this side, there's farmland here. And it's getting more and more difficult to farm this land. It's getting saltier a little bit in the waters that they're using. Highway 37 is down here at the end, which has been flooding more often. Sea level rise is a concern. down here. If you've ever, if you go with the Friends of the Petaluma River, occasionally this is a rock and ranch down here that you see, and there's a big fancy building now sitting here. So a .comer came in, bought all this land, but he supports the Friends of the Petaluma River, and we've actually had parties down there, annual fundraiser type things. And he's got a little private airport here on the runways. Then looking at the same spot, this is looking downriver, about halfway down, and this is halfway there on the hillside looking up. And you can see some of this dendritic patterns coming through. There's some cabins over in here that David Yearsley used to use, that are still used by Friends of the Petaluma River, that you can kayak out to. I was out there just a couple months ago. But the river turns, and you see this new channel that's here. And now this side is the still a fairly original marsh. And of the original marsh of 5,000 acres, there's only 2,000 acres left in this original marsh. This land over here is ag land. So we have 3,000 acres have been converted mostly to agricultural production over time. And you can see that in this picture down in here. That's where this is the entry from the bay, the San Pablo Bay comes in. And the water that comes in is already brackish, considered brackish, because salt water is usually 3%, ocean water is 3%. And then when it enters into San Francisco Bay, it mixes with the fresh water from the Sacramento and the Delta area that's coming in. And by the time it gets to the San Pablo Bay edge up here, up in the north, it's probably getting down to 2 or 1.5% salt. And so it's brackish water basically coming in up the river. And then we have fresh water in the rainy season that comes back down. And those two, and then so you have a battle, fresh water, salt water, back and forth twice a day, every 25 hours tide. There's movement back and forth. And then we know Harris Highway 37 starts right about here and comes across. And that is in some areas, as you go down across heading toward Novato, is getting flooded now constantly. And the farmers here, there's now discussions about how to change all of this land and to save our marshland, because our marshland's under threat from sea level rise, because it's expected to be 3 feet in the next 50 to 100 years, but it's going to be 10 feet in the next 200 years. So if we really want to look forward, we're going to have a sea level rise of over 10 feet in the next 100 to 200 years. And so we have these predictions, and there's no way of stopping it at this point in time. So it's going to rise up over time. So it's a matter of how can we save our marsh in the meantime, save our wetlands, save carbon sequestration, and lots of discussions are happening now throughout the entire Bay Area, which is there's a whole the governments all over the Bay have gotten together and have realized this, and there's regional organizations now looking at how to save our Bay and restoration work, working with the sea level rise that's going to be happening over the next 50 to 200 years. So that's going to be continuous effort. Okay, so that's tell you a little bit there. We can get more deeper into that if you like, but I can tell you a little bit about some of the plans that they have for down in this area in here. Restoration has already started at Sears Point, but they're thinking about coming up the river and working with all these farmers up here and how to change over some of these lands and modify it to keep the sea level rise from doing too much damage to the marsh. Okay, this next picture is, again, human intervention has come in, especially Europeans with the last 150 years. What you see, all these marks, all these lines, these are the wetlands we have lost. The entire east side, we have basically paved over. Remember the song, Paved Over Paradise? Well, that's what we did here. Mm-hmm. This was a complete wetlands, a functional wetlands, completely channelized. All the creeks have been channelized. They're all going straight from right about here. Instead of being a delta and moving into this delta pattern, they took the creek and channeled it and cut a deep thing and made a ditch, went all the way there straight to, and some of it are straight, like Adobe Creek, just straight line, right into the river. Same thing with Ellis Creek and with Lynch Creek, Washington Creek. They were all dug out and channelized to make this whole area suburbia. So that's the one thing we're living with now. It's a shame. I didn't realize it at the time that I moved here, what was going on. But now I do. I says, oh, okay, we need to do something about this. Then in other areas, these are mostly ag lands down here, ag lands all throughout here, ag lands and airport down in this section in here. That was done, and even a resort that was down here that's no longer functional, that they had a resort going. And this is, And some of these areas are still considered wild and are used by fish and game, and they're wildlands that are allowed for fishing and hunting. So you'll see folks out there with shotguns. You'll hear shotguns, and even up in here, they're allowed to, in certain areas, to hunt for birds. Okay. And so these are other areas there. Okay, next one. So this is some vocabulary. So as tidal, so the tides usually there's a zero line. That's ocean level. 0, is if the ocean was totally calm and no movement going in and out. That's where 0 is. And then this is going down and then going up. And we have king tides go up to almost 8 feet that come up the Petaluma River. So 8 feet, and then usually a drop of 2 or 3 feet easily most of the time. So there's a 10-foot rise and fall of our slough on a 24-hour basis during king tides. And they happen once or twice a year. We just had a few of them just this last month. I was out kayaking. You actually almost kayak across the whole marsh. Okay, so so as the rise and fall at the 0 mark down here, you'll see there's a mark orange versus yellow. So it's below where it's below area is subtidal, which means pretty much it's underwater almost 90% of the time or more. Then you have your mud flats, which become, as the water recedes, becomes dry, and we have a grazed marsh is a mud flat, and they stay as mud flats because the rising waters come in, and plants cannot survive in these mud flats. It's just too much water inundation, not enough oxygen in the soil to use. It's a different ecosystem. And then as there's a little bit in here, even though there's a little bit higher waters that come up here, the plants can start surviving. And this is where you start getting in your cord grasses, and we have both native and non-native here present. There's Spartina species. There's 2. There's a hybrid that there's a species came in from the East Coast, and that's taller, bigger, and there's hybrids are even bigger and taller that combined with our small, short cordgrass species, which is much more aggressive and clogs channels. Then above that is our pickleweed, which was, you saw pictures of that, and that is a very salt tolerant plant, and that's a lot of salt marsh has pickleweed in it. But these are the main plants that are coming up. And then there's the non-tidal area, which is called upland. The non-tidal areas is upland. Okay, everyone doing okay so far? Is my speed okay? I talk real fast sometimes.
It's
Okay,
good.
everyone's okay. Okay, so this is just another.
It's great.
So here's the waters that are coming in. Of course, you have the water animals and plants underneath here. Then the mud flats come up, and then you have high tides, mean tides, and where the high tide hits up here. From up here, from the high tide, this is called the upland from where the high tide ends. So this is intertidal zone. Here's the tidal zone down in here, intertidal zone, and then the upland up here. And the species of plants are going to change and shift. At Schollenberger Park, turns out the other thing is we call it our public wetlands. Almond Marsh is not natural. Schollenberger Park is not natural. And Ellis Creek is not natural. They were all farms at one time, and they were taken over by the city over time, all 3 different purchases. And Almond Marsh was a dump site. It was a city dump for many years in the late 1800s, early 1900s, all the way through 1950, I think. And so that's the reason the fence is there, keep people out because it's so dangerous to walk out there. That all the trash is still underground. But native plants have come in and filled in quite nicely and made it look very natural. At Schollenberger Park was a farm at one time. It was diked and farmed, and then it was purchased and made into dredge spoils and and all the large dikes around it were made larger with special soils. They were brought in called bay mud. They're firmer and harder than other things, compact better. So and ponded, so it's basically creating pond areas, internal ponds. And so how that's been treated over time, completely not natural setting. Ellis Creek was Gray's farm. That's why it's called Gray's Marsh. It was Gray's farm. And he sort of, as he got older, he didn't have the money and the time to get the dike, got caved in on him, and he never fixed it. It was not productive fields. He grew wheat out there, and that's what's turned into the marsh. And then the upper areas turned into the recycled treatment plant. So there's long stories about that. So our public wetlands that we talk about here, all these different habitats and everything, are completely artificial. But they still have some good representation. We talk about it. But if you look across the river, and then down, there's still 13 miles of river there, of slough, and across, and then the actual natural marsh is about still 2,000 acres, was 5,000 acres. And so that's where we'd like to get more people to actually take kayaks and small boats down with Friends of the Petaluma River and seek out what the true marsh looks like down there, which is going to be a little different from what we call our public wetlands. So I just want to make sure we're clear that we're not telling the folks that what we see at Schellenberger is natural in any way, shape, or form. And it's a completely artificial environment. Okay.
Yeah, but the birds love it, right?
The birds still love it. Oh, the other thing on
They don't care.
the dredge spoils pond, the fresh water, because it's artificial. We have these 3 water types. We have fresh water from the rain, which also gets contaminated with the fertilizers from this urban runoff. We have the Ellis Creek area is fresh water from the plant, and birds love that as a separate environment. All the different plants, animals live there. We have almond marsh, which has turned into water comes in and out of it constantly every day with the tides. So it's in that intertidal area and a lot of pickleweed. So there's certain animals and plants that love that section, which are very different. So that's one of the reasons we have wonderful habitats in very close proximity, because we've created these habitats for everyone to kind of visit, which makes it kind of neat. So it's not one habitat throughout the whole area. We have 4 or 5 different habitats throughout our 3 parks there: Almond Marsh, Schellenberger, and Ellis Creek.
John, question?
Yeah.
Where does the water that's in the dredging ponds, does it come from? Where did it come from? Is that strictly rainwater?
Okay, there's 3 or 4 different sources of water that comes into our what's called central pond. And they diked off the area between the central pond and what used to be the area by the river. That used to be part of the dredge spoils, but that filled up. They filled that up with dredge material. And then they went and diked it all off. And that's now considered a habitat because enough pickleweed is growing there for the saltwater harvest mouse, which is an endangered species. And ours, we have a different subspecies up here compared to what's in the lower marsh areas or down in the south in the lower bay areas. So, we still have to find these species up here. The other thing that we've got is, just what I've written here. I added in, this is a picture I grabbed off the web the other day. Here again, you see the cordgrass, the various Spartinas, different species. We're growing slightly different sections. We have the pickweeds. Up here, when the tide comes in and lays down water, and then it evaporates off. So this area here becomes much more saltier because of the evaporation. And that's where we have all the salt ponds down in the South Bay, where we actually had most of our salt production throughout California, was in our salt ponds, which are now being restored down in the South Bay. That's a whole nother story that we could tell about the restoration of the salt ponds down there. But the salt marsh are much higher salt. And our central pond, when it's dredged, water comes in with the dredging, which is basically slough water, which is ocean water mixed with some fresh water. But during October, this is mostly ocean water coming up, not fresh water coming down. So it's very salty, like up to 2% salt. And it got dumped in and then evaporated or got leached out. So the salt concentration changed from moderate 2 to 3%. And as the water evaporated, we took some measurements recently. It went up over 25%. It went off the scale. We couldn't even measure it. It was so high in there, 25%. And then they released a lot of that water slowly into the graze field, and they had to actually aerate it to go in. So make it legal so that we didn't destroy anything with the high salt, low oxygen. And then with the water that now comes in is a combination of rainwater comes in over the top. And then we also have, there are sloughs and pipes of the underground. A lot of the city urban water flow comes underground, under the road, under the buildings, and enters into the freshwater channel. And that's why it always has water there in the freshwater channel. And that's connected by a weir that connects in with the central pond. And so there's fresh water that flows in, which may sometimes has fertilizer contamination in it. So it's the other thing we need to start measuring is actually the nitrogen content of the water coming into that area. That's why it's such lush and green, because of all the fertilizer that comes in with the urban runoff.
What about the wastewater ponds, though?
The wastewater ponds, Ellis Creek, those are all managed and controlled intensely by our water treatment plant, and they monitor the waters constantly over there. So the ponds are finishing ponds. So they're already almost drinkable when they enter into those ponds. They just haven't had the final tertiary treatment. They're allowed to sit in those ponds and take out all the heavy metals are absorbed by the reeds of the plants. That's why the reeds are there. Especially the bulrush is very good at absorbing the mercuries and other leads and other chemicals that might be in the water still. A lot of the fertilizer, that phosphorus and nitrogen is still in the water, gets absorbed by the plants. And that's why that has to be, and then they harvest those reeds and actually incinerate them in a special place because those heavy metals can be toxic, especially mercury. So that's a whole treatment that they do over there at Ellis Creek.
But where did that water come from originally that went into those ponds?
Those ponds, that's our poopy water, comes from our homes.
Oh, all that. Okay.
Yeah, so that comes through all the water treatment plant, which is state of the art, which is fabulous. They got green roofs on the buildings. I talked to the engineer, Margaret Orr, who designed that plant. And it is very high-end, state-of-the-art plant. And so it's definitely worth a visit to go over there if you haven't been over there.
John, how will sea level rise affect the water treatment plant, and how high up the river? In other words, what parts of the river will become brackish over the next, I don't know, 50 years?
I'll show you. I've got a slide that'll go over that.
Okay,
but the actual water treatment plant is safe for about the first 100 years. We're talking about a 3, 4, even a 5-foot level rise. The water treatment plant itself is safe from about a 4-foot sea level rise. But the next 100 years, maybe not so much. But at least for the next 100 years, we're okay for water treatment. So we will have that.
So if everyone does a lot of carbon sequestration and all the other things that are necessary to not encourage climate change, then maybe we can avoid that scenario?
No, unfortunately, the research I've been reading and seeing about sea level rise is that it's unstoppable. It's going to happen, even if we do the best we can right now. So sea level rise is on track, and even with everything that we can do, we can slow it down. So instead of having maybe 3 or 4 foot, we're going to have 2 already. No matter what we do now, we're going to have 3-foot rise, no matter what we do. Now, whether we get to 10 to 15-foot rise, that we may be able to modify in the second 100 years. But the carbon that's already in the air is already up there. And it's going to take 100 years plus for it to leave. And so we're going to see the melting of the ice caps, Antarctica, over the next 100 years for sure. No stopping it. But we can slow it down for following after that. So it's the second 100 years that I'm worried about, not the first 100. Okay, so the other thing about this is just looking at stress on plants and why we have all these different habitats within our little area of our wetlands, because we have all these little hills that we've built up and little pockets of water, changing of salt water content, even in Ellis Creek, the water changes, evaporates off, gets removed and moved around. So there's physical stresses, mostly salt. Oh, there's another water. There's groundwater. There's groundwater, fresh water flowing down from the hills, comes underneath, but there's seawater that seeps in and then joins, and there's a mixing zone. And right in here in our area is where it all mixes. So sometimes in high tides, the actual salt water will leach in and push up into the salt flats. And that's why it's also salty, because the salt water will push up, evaporate off, leaving salt on the top, as well as the water flowing in and evaporating off. So we have underground water as well. So physical stress for the environment between the water layers, the salt content makes it tougher to live this way, and there's plants have ways of dealing with that. And then the competition, as you go toward the uplands, more competition. And that's where the invasive plants from Europe mostly came in, that were brought in with all the wheat and all the weed seeds. And that's where we're at. So 80% of, or 90% of our plants and in our wetlands, in our public wetlands that we tour around, are non-native. But in these areas down in here, these are all natives in these areas, because the Europeans can't survive past this little zone down in here. They just can't survive down in these areas here. So this area is still quite natural for us in native plants. But anything above this line here is almost all non-natives now in our area. Okay, another thing on here, we got a diagram of the interactions. All of the wetlands, there's huge amount of science and deal with the tidal change that's happening every 20, there's 2 tides every 25 hours. So with those changing water levels, sediment is a huge thing. Sediment coming in and going out constantly, being changed constantly. We have erosion happening on our hillsides, fresh sediments coming in, sediments from the gold rush coming in that still contain mercury from all the hills that are coming down. So this water is coming in, flowing constantly, back and forth, back and forth. And the land and the plants and the animals have to modify twice a day where they go, what they move. The animals move up and down, up physically, up and down in the soil based on the water movements. And then side to side with the plants are able to survive these areas and tolerate this movement. Then lots of other things come down when you have storms coming in, changing water. You have salinity changing constantly, and everything from 0.5% all the way up to the 2+%. So it's the salinity of the water in the whole area changes constantly. Evaporation in the summer on the surfaces changes. So the salinity content on surfaces will change throughout the seasons. Elevated carbon dioxide in the air is actually, we're expected to actually grow better crops over time because more CO2 in the air. Plants love CO2, they grow faster and better. And especially if you add in our wastewater, which has nitrogen and phosphorus in it, plants love this. So when you combine that together, some of the wetlands actually may grow bigger and better in some locations. But lots of turnover happens. Plants die, and there's a constant reservoir of carbon and a constant changeover of carbon from the growth and the death. And so the changeover in carbon in our wetlands here is equal to a rainforest. In fact, it's sometimes even higher than a rainforest. Our carbon interactions and changes over the year, the amount of carbon that moves is actually greater than what happens in a rainforest. So this biomass accumulation, this mucky soil in here is I call it, the soil is alive. It's not mud, it's living soil that's actually working. So this mud is alive. Lots of nutrients and changes are happening so there's a constant change, and with sea level rise, we're seeing there'll be a shift in where all the wetlands and all the plants are going. Okay, coming back to what you saw earlier, this is a little bit more detailed, a different style of food web, whereas we have pelagic is water, benthic is the muddy bottom, where it starts. So there's different ecosystems throughout in the water system versus the soil, the bottom of the soil. And as the soil, you go up into more upland area, it will change. So different habitats, different ecosystems, different food webs happening, different organisms living, and constantly interchanging throughout, and very complex. So that's one of them. But if you get over here to detritus, there's this mud, and this mud is all this dead material is dying and staying put, and it's anaerobic. So it tends to put there and becomes peat over time, and eventually becomes oil, shale, and liquefied and gas underground. And that's where most of our fossil fuels have come from, is from these marshes that got buried. So it didn't come from dinosaurs. Our fossil fuels did not come from dinosaurs. It came from marsh plants. That's sort of like an urban myth that it came from dinosaurs, but it's the marshes back in the dinosaur days, 250 million years ago. All the marshland that was in Pangea got buried deeper and deeper under the ocean, and it got placed and got old. And so that's where all our fossil fuels are come from. And we've probably gone through maybe a third of all our fossil fuels. That's a whole nother topic we can get into, is now all that old marshland that's now buried is now being consumed by us. So 250 million years of marshland burying has now been unearthed by us within 100 years, not the 250 million years it took to create all that stuff. And we've used a third of it in basically 100 years. And at the pace we're going, we'll use it up in the next few hundred years. So different geologic timescales here, folks. All right, so this is, but in the detritus food chain, and there's a whole food chain that's in marshes that are different from your standard food chain that everyone learns in ecology. There's a lot more cycling going on. So especially in the invertebrate world, the stuff is living in the soil. Lots of stuff is eating all there's the algae that's growing and dying constantly, being eaten by all these arthropods and invertebrates, which are eating each other. They all die, become the part of the detritus, and there's a big cycle that's going just in the mud itself. And then other things will enter in. Oh, okay. And all this plant material is coming in, all the phytoplankton's coming in, leaves are coming down and mixing in with all the sediments that are coming in. So this all creates a whole habitat in the mud and lots of living organisms. And then what's happening circulates entirely down there. And then eventually it rises up through the food chain as other things as these animals get eaten by the larger animals, and goes up to the trophic levels, going up to the larger animals. So it feeds the food chain. And there's approximately 10% energy conversion. It's happening constantly down in the detritus area in the mud. But as you go up the line through this change, every trophic level is considered about you use 90% of the energy eaten just to survive and heat yourself and live. And then 10% of it gets stored in your body. And the next level up, so the mass down here, if you start off with 1,000 metric tons, then you go to 10 metric tons in the next level, then you go to 1 metric ton in the next level, and then you get down to 0.1 metric ton, and then you get down to 0.1 metric tons of actual biomass in the top level up here. It's about a 10% savings of biomass as you go up the food chain. Okay. Next one, titles. Just remember, the mud is alive. These are the organisms that are living in the mud down in that Gray's Marsh floodplain down there, which is all tidal marsh. And it's been that way I've seen it for close to 30 years. It's been pretty similar, but you can see it does change a little bit over time. And some of the, especially along the edges and some of the edges are growing up and sediments actually getting laid down on some of the edges. And so that is growing and building up a little bit, and that marsh is Gray's Marsh is getting a little bit smaller each year. But this shows just the diversity of animals that will be living in the mud, that this is what the birds eat. And one of these days, we really need to do a study of what's in there. I'm trying to get the San Francisco Estuary Institute up here to help us understand what's happening in that mud flat.
Yeah, that's the part I find so fascinating.
Yeah, so that's a future study I'd like to have happen one of these days if we can. I want to talk to SFEI about that. I think a lot of it's done in the Bay Area. A lot of that is done in the mudflats down there, but we just haven't had it done up here. Okay, this shows you sea level rise. This is in 100 years with a 3-foot sea level rise with maybe a little bit of a king tide and a little bit of a storm coming in, not major, but just what's going to happen in 100 years. With the 3-foot rise. And what you see in blue here, that's going to turn into basically a lake. It's going to be a shallow lake, and this is all going to be mud flat. This entire area up in here will turn into mud flat if we do nothing at this point. Same thing with all the way up here in Sonoma. All these areas in here will either be underwater or turned into mud flat. And that's why Highway 37 discussion is not just building a road down here, but it really needs to be talked about with all the sea level rise, the 100 and 200 year plan that we need to start developing. And so lots and lots of discussions happening now, fortunately, a little late, but we are actually talking about it now and what to do about it on a regional basis. This is happening all over the Bay Area. So we are at high risk of losing the entire Petaluma Marsh over time.
John, where would you place Sid Commons on this map?
Sid Commons is going to be up in here. And it turns out, looking at the elevations, actually, Sid Commons is like right on the edge of a flood. Knows if fresh water comes down from the rainfall, if it's very high rains like we recently had, there may have been a little bit of flooding there. And the FEMA maps are being changed again, and everyone's looking at this very intensely. I know you and Beverly are working very hard on looking at the flood zone. So as sea level rises, there'll be more flooding over time. So that's the other thing we need to make sure that everyone in the government in the city understands, that when you have sea level rise plus the heavy rains that are coming that we just recently had, which is going to get worse over time, that Sid Commons will be flooded occasionally in the future, and that's pretty much an absolute. But they're just developers just going to walk away from that. But anyway, that's
So
we can get into that discussion later.
This is an updated map. This is an updated one.
This is what I have, the most recent. This came from a couple, I guess, a month ago, off of there's a couple of different websites, and they slightly differ in. And this is not the FEMA website. This is, I grabbed this over a nonprofit organization that's doing this globally, worldwide. They're creating these maps for everybody around the globe. And so this is the map that was generated from their website.
So what is this map saying about what will happen downtown?
So downtown, this area right here, which is right here where you see this thing, see this whole area there? Yeah, it's going to get flooded. So downtown area is going to be underwater in 100 to 200 years from now.
Well, when I've gone over Lakeville near the Clover Creamery, and with that little bridge over the river there, and by the feed mill, and you can see the new North River apartments there, and it's hard to believe that they would have built them that close to the river without thinking they might get flooded. What do you think?
Well, I think we're going to be okay for the next 50 years, even maybe the next 100 years. It's going to be manageable, and we can work with it. We can put up walls and things in case we get really bad. And the thing is, we are building with a 50-year plan ahead. Few people are building with a 100-year plan ahead, and nobody is really building 150 to 200 years ahead. So we have to change our way of thinking. Developers are thinking 5 years ahead. Oh, as long as I build it, everyone gets populated, I sell it, and I'm gone, and my legal liabilities are gone in 5 years. Oh, I don't have to worry about it. And then the new owners who may or may not realize what's going, like I moved into this wetland. I didn't know what I moved into, and now I'm living in it. I'm going, oh, ouch. I shouldn't be living here, but I am. So now I'm dealing with it. So that's what we're going to be facing over the next 100 years from now. Our grandchildren, not us, not our children, probably our grandchildren are going to be dealing heavily throughout the world with the issues that we've created over the last 100 years. So this is our big, that's why I'm on a mission now. I am doing lots of work now with the city and every committee I'm going to, talking about climate change, sea level rise, and modifications, natural solutions, nature-based solutions that we can do now, and really pumping up the idea, because we really got to start working now to do all that. Anyway, so that's why I'm on so many committees right now.
That's incredible and wonderful.
Yeah. Okay. So that's the bad news that's coming. One of my phrases, chaos is coming, and so we need to prepare. This is what we can do. This is a map actually from the city and from which is they've actually kept. It also came from SFEI study, the same place of historic wetlands. These are the possibilities. This is what we can do. This is the areas that we can repair using nature-based solutions. These are all ag lands. We can convert back to marsh and change the way we dike and the way we do things down here, building, the way we use our sediment, collect the sediment from the river dredging, place it in certain places, rebuild the dikes in certain ways, and slowly convert all this back into wetlands entirely, which would be a savings grace, because that's a lot of flood water would be saved there, both coming up and coming down in our marshland. And then all along these little creeks up here, we can do little conversions and create lots of reservoirs, small meadows, all along each of these creeks, catchment basins that will help our drainage and move water and collect water. And we can manage our floodplains up here. This is all going to get flooded up here, but if we do things like take that whole well, we have the shopping center that's down there in the floodplain. probably they built it knowing that they're going to be flooded constantly, and they actually have 3-foot high foundations above the ground before they put the buildings down. So you notice there's cement going up for foundations that actually go above ground. And all the stores there are designed and actually built for 3 feet of water to come in and out constantly over time. But leave those buildings alone, but turn this whole area into a park with dredge, with catchment basins and for flooding, so that we have less flooding coming downstream into the downtown area when that happens. And also use it as a park and bikeways and pathways to get across town back and forth. There's use the Rainier as a bike path to get across town and for other electric small mobiles to get across. There is actually even a bridge nobody knows about. There's already a little bridge, a little walkway bridge that goes across. But it's blocked off right now, I think because of the train and things. Okay, but these are possibilities that we know we could actually do something. And I'm working with the Watershed Coalition, and they're trying to put together 10 proposals to start working now, building various nature-based solutions throughout the entire watershed. And so there's several proposals that are going to be happening with that group there, and which we will continue hopefully over time. And some things, and I believe in doing things, think global, but act local. So here's what we did. When the dredging happened, brought in all sorts of trash, huge amount of plastic and rubber and car parts and golf balls and bowling balls, ended up in our river, got moved with the dredge, came into our thing. And we spent at 14 trips out there over a 14-day period. We collected a truckload of trash every single day of those 14 days using volunteers. This is the most Coast Guard folks came in with a couple families here, and which is really nice. All these big muscular guys. Yeah, who's the captain? Little gal here. She was the captain. So these guys are just like, she said a word, boy, they moved. Whatever she said, something. So that was really nice to see. Anyway, so we do take action locally, and Petaluma Wetlands Alliance is all about, we're trying to help out at our wetlands parks, doing our education, doing all the things that we do, cleaning up invasive plant work, working with signage, education through the kiosks, getting benches out there, memorialize, getting more people engaged with nature. It's the most popular park in the whole city for a number of people that walk it and come out and visit with us. So this is our opportunity, why we exist and why we are so motivated, because this is where we really engage the public and creating a nature public interaction that is very active and progressive. So this is where we make it happen. So this is why I'm part of this group and why we do all these things that we do. Okay, so that's the end of my presentation, but Q&A now.